The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
And a reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
According to you, Lord.
When the Pharisees, with some scribes who had come from Jerusalem, gathered around Jesus, they observed that some of his disciples ate their meals with unclean, that is, unwashed hands. For the Pharisees, and in fact all Jews, do not eat without carefully washing their hands, keeping the tradition of the elders. And on coming from the marketplace, they do not eat without purifying themselves. And there are many other things that they have traditionally observed: the purification of cups and jugs and kettles and beds. So the Pharisees and scribes questioned him, "Why do your disciples not follow the tradition of the elders, but instead eat a meal with unclean hands?" He responded, "Well, did Isaiah prophesy about you hypocrites, as it is written? This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines human precepts. You disregard God's commandment, but cling to human tradition." He summoned the crowd again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. Nothing that enters one from outside can defile that person, but the things that come out from within are what defile. For within people, from their hearts, come evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness, envy, blasphemy, arrogance, folly. All these evils come from within, and they defile." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
For the past 5 weeks, our Sunday Gospels had been taken from the 6th chapter of St. John's Gospel, which contains that discourse of Jesus as the bread of life. This Sunday, we return to our reading from the Gospel of St. Mark, beginning with chapter 7. And we will hear Mark's Gospel for the remainder of the church year until the beginning of Advent. Now, I think it's safe to say that Americans have a deep attachment to law and order. We pride ourselves on being law-abiding citizens. And to prove it, we support more lawyers per capita than any other nation on earth. Now, I like to think of myself as a law-abiding citizen, but I must confess, however, that at times I do take some liberties with one respect to the law. Posted speed limits. Though I'm much better about this now than I used to be, though Bishop Jenke might argue that point. In my younger years, I was not particularly a model citizen in this regard. And this was especially true during my first assignment as a newly ordained priest when I was stationed at one of our Holy Cross parishes in Austin, Texas. At the time, my parents lived in Dallas, over 200 miles away, and my mother was quite ill, dying from emphysema. So I tried to visit my folks every week. Just one problem. Those were the days of the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. Nothing seemed as interminable as creeping along Interstate 35 between Austin and Dallas and back at what I considered a snail's pace. Well, on one of these long, drawn-out drives, I remember hearing a Baptist preacher on the radio suggest some favorite hymn tunes for those struggling with the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. For those obeying the law, the hymn, "Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah," seemed appropriate. For those inching up to 65, "Nearer, My God, to Thee." 75 miles per hour, "Nearer, still nearer." 85 miles per hour, "This world is not my home." 95 miles an hour, "Lord, I'm coming home." And for those going over 100, "Precious Memories." Now keep these titles in mind when you're driving back to home this morning. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm much better about obeying speed limits than I used to be. Obeying the law, not speed limits, but the law of Moses, his statutes and decrees, which we heard about in our first reading this morning from the book of Deuteronomy, was something that the scribes and the Pharisees took very seriously. And in addition to this written law from the first 5 books of the Old Testament, they also observed the so-called oral law. And the oral law comprised some 613 precepts, which were intended to protect and preserve the written law. The Pharisees believed that holiness could be achieved by meticulously observing both the written law of Moses as well as the oral law with its 613 precepts. Now, one such example of these precepts is mentioned in this morning's gospel, the ritual washing of hands. According to the oral law, hand washing was not simply a matter of good personal hygiene. It was a means of attaining ceremonial or ritual cleanness, that is, holiness. Before every meal and between each course of every meal, hands were washed according to a specific procedure. Detailed regulations were also to be observed in the washing of cups, jugs, kettles, and other such vessels. Now, in this morning's gospel, the Pharisees and the scribes, ever vigilant, observed that some of Jesus' disciples exhibited a wanton disregard for such practices, and so they questioned Jesus about this. For Jesus, many of the Pharisees had lost sight of the fact that holiness was less a matter of ritual observance as a transformation from within, a change of heart, which was then outwardly translated into works and words of mercy, a way of life rooted in love. Thomas Merton, the famous Trappist monk, priest, and author who died in 1968, once said that holy persons can be recognized by the way they talk, by the way they walk, and by the way they hold their hands. No doubt St. James, whom we heard from in our second reading this morning, would have agreed. For St. James, authentic holiness, like authentic faith, must be translated into actions that are as real and practical as walking and talking and holding things in our hands. Going a second mile, speaking a kind word or a word of forgiveness, offering a cup of cold water to the thirsty, food to the hungry, clothing to the poor, alms to orphans and widows. St. James put it well, very well this morning. Be doers of the word and not hearers only, deluding yourselves. It is a tragedy when fixation can miss the heart of the matter. As Catholics, at times, we, like those scribes and Pharisees, can become more preoccupied with external rituals and obligations than with the inner purity that those rituals and obligations are intended to foster. Jesus, along with St. James, reminds all of us today that religion, if it is to be pure and undefiled, has to do with the heart and its desires. The loving or hateful things we do. For example, those accused of sexual abuse have their roots there in our heart's desires. I began this homily by saying that I like to think of myself as a law-abiding citizen, though I struggle a little bit with speed limits. If I obey the law, I know I will not get into trouble and won't have to worry about getting a ticket. But the law of God implies something much more than mere external ritual observance. For the heart of the law of God is not about not getting into trouble, but rather how we live, the way we walk, the way we talk, and the way we hold things in our hands and let go of them.